Welcome to Live Life with Sean. I'm your host, Sean Higgins. I'm a lifelong information security technology expert with a passion for speaking, coaching, and writing. In this podcast, I'm going to talk to you about what's going on in my life. And I hope that by me talking about it will help you with whatever's going on in your life. This show is recorded live, and you're invited to add your questions to the discussion. If I don't get to your questions during the show, I'll do my best to answer them on my blog or at a future show. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe to it, share it, like it, and or leave a comment or question, as this will help others find this podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. And, today is March the 11th. It is the 1-year anniversary since the World Health Organization declared COVID a pandemic. And I'm just going to take a moment here because I did talk about back on show 23, talked about how are you doing with COVID, and I talked about how I'm dealing with it. So I won't spend a lot of time on it today, but I was just reflecting about it for a bit because this week I talked to a friend of mine, probably one of the first friends that I ever remember. This predates elementary school. I was connecting with him because he's been struggling with COVID. He's been in a hospital for, he said, I think he was in a hospital for just over a week, getting all the special drugs that former President Trump got. And when I talked to him, he was about a day away from going home, still had pneumonia. Whew, not good. But it was something that he could go home and just be with as opposed to being stuck in a hospital. So I wish him well. And I know that I've been touched by COVID from a number of people. I've had, just this friend, several clients. I mean, I was working with a client, all of a sudden he was gone for a week and, COVID went right through his family. So it touches a lot of us. Just take a moment and be thankful for your health and hope and pray for all those that have COVID today. Thank you. Tonight, I want to continue on my economics thoughts and changes to my approach. I mean, it started out when I talked about a book called The Deficit Myth on episode 20, and also talking about a new approach to economics in episode 22. And tonight, I was listening to a podcast by Brene Brown. Love Brene Brown, love reading her books. She was in a conversation with Simon Sinek, and the title of the podcast was Developing an Infinite Mindset. And this discussion centered around Simon's new book entitled The Infinite Game. And he based it on a book by James Carson that was published back in 1986 called Finite and Infinite Games. And in his book, he said a finite game is played for the purpose of winning. An infinite game is played for the purpose of continuing play. And if you think about it, there are lots of things that are finite games. Sports, big infinite games. There's a lot of rules with sports. There's predefined number of players, how they can substitute in. There's a predefined time limit, way to keep score, and there's a clearly defined winners and losers in sports. It's the same with chess. It's the same with most board games and most card games. Okay, I'm going to say most only because I'm not 100% certain. But I know most card games are played to win or lose. I think the only exception I remember is, I remember these sisters that I met at a conference I was at, and they were sitting there with deck of cards in front of them, cards in their hands, and they were moving them around, picking them up, laying them down, and I remember talking to them, and they said that that's what they do. They just pick up cards, kind of shuffle them through their hand, and put them down, and just talk. So the card game was just, I don't know, it was just part of what they did, and there was no winning or losing in the card game. So that was probably the only card game that I know that is an infinite card game. Um, when James Carson talks about an infinite game, what he says that he defines an infinite game. Actually, I think Simon defined it this way. I haven't read James's book, but he defines an infinite game as there may be known as well as unknown players. New players can join at any time or leave at any time. Each player has their own strategy. There is no set of fixed rules. I think the one exception, we'll get back to this, and there's no beginning or ending. And Simon's premise is that business is an infinite game. Think about it for a moment. If you're running a business, you don't know who all the players are. You don't know who all your competition is. New competition can crop up and leave at any time. You don't know what the guy down the street, his strategy to running his business. And then other than laws or regulations that the government puts on you, there's really no rules. There's no rules that say you have to have a certain price for your items, or how many different items you have, how many people you employ or don't employ. And realistically, Simon's premise, and I'm tending to believe Simon in this, is that there's really no, well, there may be a beginning. You may begin a business, but there's really no defined end. It isn't like you're in a business and 5 years down the road you say, "Oh, I won. Game's over. Close my shop." There's really no end. And if you think about the definition of an infinite game, the purpose of an infinite game is just to continue to play. And really think about it. What is the purpose of a business? You want a business to keep running. You just want it to keep going, especially if you're the owner of the business. The only time you want it to end is when you want to get out of it. And the business may outlive you. And for the most part, well, I won't say the most part, businesses were really were operated as infinite games. And that dates back to The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which was published way back in 1776. He was one of the first economists to write about capitalism. And the main premise there was businesses are about people over profits. And he really defined capitalism in this realm as just, he didn't use an infinite game term, but it allows business to just keep running. And this is how it operated until about the mid 70s when Milton Friedman, another famous economist, came along and said the sole purpose of a corporation is to serve the shareholders. Period. End of sentence. There's no other purpose for the corporation. And I think I've seen a graph that for most of for as far back as they were keeping records, productivity would increase, and as productivity increased, wages would keep pace with productivity. Long about in the 70s, when Milton Friedman came along, he said, hey, the only purpose of a corporation is to serve the shareholders. You started to see productivity continue to increase and wages start to level off. And that's been that way ever since Milton Friedman came along. And this was really popularized by Jack Welch in the 80s at General Electric. And I have to admit, I was an employee at General Electric. I started as a co-op back in 83. And Jack Welch was the CEO while I was there. And I didn't really understand him. I kind of heard about his programs, but I'm an employee way down at the bottom. He's way up here, and didn't really get touched by some of the things he did. I kind of understood him, but I didn't. It wasn't until after he left GE, I had long left GE, I started reading some of his books, and I will admit that I was buying into what he was saying. I remember being at GE, and one of his driving forces was we need to be one or two in every industry. And if we're not, we're either going to make ourselves one or two, or we're going to get rid of that business. I was lucky I was in lighting. We were number one in the world, so didn't have to worry so much about that. He also talked about ranking your employees A, B, or C. A are your top performers. That's your top 10%. B's are your good employees, and that's the middle 80%. And C's are the low end of the totem pole. You're supposed to spend most of your time with your A's because they'll get you more benefit. B's, you keep them doing what they're doing. And C's, Jack's premise, and I'm not sure I really believe this, but I did believe in the ranking of the employees. With the C's, you had to decide whether you were going to try and make them B's or just get rid of them. I didn't like that, get rid of them. I did like ranking the employees because it helped me understand how to deal with them. Anyway, let me get through this. Maybe I'll come back to that. And one of the other things that Jack made popular was layoffs. Layoffs to make the bottom line look good. You remember, Jack Welch was driving the corporation to serve the shareholders. Okay, that's all he cared about. He did a great job of it. But after listening to and looking back on what Jack drove the business to do, I'm not so much of a fan, because I'm not a fan of the divide that this sole purpose of the corporation of making the shareholders wealthy and at the expense of everything else just does not make sense to me. I really believe that corporations are there, and I think I talked about this on an earlier podcast, to serve four groups of people. I believe there was three, but I've expanded it to four. First off is customers. Customers are number one. The customers, okay. I don't know if I should rank them one. I always think customers are most important. That's how when I'm doing my work, the customer is the important one. And number two, the employees. The employees are there. So first, if you don't have customers, you don't have revenue coming in. Second, you don't have employees, you don't have if you don't have employees, who's going to make the product or service that the customers are going to buy? Third is shareholders, And those are the people that own the business. So they're going to want to get a return on the investment they're making into the business. And I like to think of those as the three legs of a stool. You get rid of any one of those, and guess what? The stool falls over. Now, I was talking about a fourth one that I think I talked about this in episode 22. It's the community that the business is in. And uh, I'm still not 100% sold on that. I think that if you do the first three, the community falls in because you're taking care of customers and employees, and that helps drive what's going on in the community. Maybe you still need to consider it. I don't know. I'm going to have to think about that one. It's not a bad one. I like the three-legged stool. It makes it easier to understand the standing. So let's talk. So Simon says, and it's kind of interesting. Simon says, when you play a finite game, when you play an infinite game as if it were a finite game, which a lot of businesses are doing today, what you see is a decline in trust within the business, a decline in cooperation within the business, and a decline in innovation within the business. And let me talk about a couple of cool examples. So I guess I should have looked up the dates. So when Steve Ballmer took over Microsoft from Bill Gates, his focus was such a narrow focus that it really hurt Microsoft. And the example that I read about was that at one point, Apple had come out with the iPod. It was the greatest music device out there to date, large market share. Microsoft was so determined to beat Apple that they spent a lot of focus, a lot of energy to come out with the Zune player. And some would say the Zune player was better than the iPod. They were so focused on this. Everything they were doing was, how do we beat Apple? How do we beat Apple? And they came out with the Zune. What did Apple do? Apple, not worried about whether their product was the best or not. What they did, their focus was, how do we become better than we were yesterday? Okay. So what did they do? They came out with the iPhone. That was their next generational shift in their business. Their focus was, how do we be better tomorrow? How do I move this forward? As opposed to, how do I beat them? Which was the Microsoft adage. Another one that was really interesting to me is Blockbuster versus Netflix. So Blockbuster owned the video rental business, just owned it, bar none. And Netflix was started out as a subscription-based DVD business, mail-in business, where you paid a subscription every month and you picked from a catalog and they mailed you a DVD. And when you were done with it, you put it in the envelope and you mailed it back to them and they mailed you another one. And that process just kept going. And that's how they kept going with their business. The CEO, and this was before streaming became popular. The CEO of Netflix went to Blockbuster and said, hey, you should buy us, $50 million. Blockbuster, billion-dollar company. I think I heard the CEO went to the board and the board was all worried about the bottom line, worried that They're making lots of money on these rentals. They're making lots of money on late fees. This subscription model, I mean, this subscription model, there's no such thing as a late fee. The person could get the DVD and hold on to it for months. Even though they're still paying their monthly rental fee, their monthly subscription fee, they just could not see the forest through the trees. The internet started taking off, Netflix started to do some streaming, and guess what? Overnight, Blockbuster was gone. I remember because I used to rent movies from Blockbuster. That used to be part of the household ritual was, go do some running around, stop by the Blockbuster, see what new releases are out, see what one I can rent, and that would be Saturday night. I remember driving into the parking lot of Blockbuster and big closed sign out of business and just could not believe it. And the first thing I did, went to the local Apple store and bought an Apple TV for, I think it was $100. So I could rent movies and stream them to my house. There were a lot of businesses who, could not see change coming, so focused on what they have in their little bucket that they're no longer around anymore. What Simon really gets into, and I'm still working through his book, he's talking about how to lead in an infinite game. And there are five points that he makes in leading in an infinite game. Number one, having a just cause. And this is something that gives your work meaning. It inspires you to get up every morning and go to work. It is something so big that you'll probably never achieve it, but you would die trying to achieve it. Think about Apple. They woke up every day, how do I be better today? This is what I have today, how do I make it better? It wasn't okay, how do I be better than Microsoft? It's how do I make this better? How do I improve this? How do I improve that? It's a just cause. It's moving it forward. It's not having a predefined end goal. Number two is having trusting teams. And that's, there aren't many organizations where there are probably really trusting teams. I think there are pockets that there's trusting teams. So trusting teams, everybody's there to help each other out, to make things better. Simon talks about going to the Four Seasons and, talking about how the people make such a difference at the Four Seasons. And he tells a story about him at the coffee shop talking to the guy at the barista, and him telling he was at the Four Seasons in Vegas. He said this guy worked at the Four Seasons at Vegas and at Caesars. Okay. At Four Seasons, he says he was wonderful. He was great. Loved his job, because people would come by, bosses and managers, and say, "How can I make your job better today?" He said at Caesars, it was all about covering your butt, making sure you didn't make any mistakes, because if you made a mistake, you'd probably get fired. and think about the businesses that you think might have trusting teams. And I can think about um, some airlines, the look at the differences in the airlines that you fly and tell me which one of them have trusting teams and which ones don't. And what you may notice is the ones with trusting teams go out of their way, have flexibility, are more focused on your experience than trying to do what's right. Ones that don't have trusting teams, there's rules and you follow the rules. And there's no way around it. There's no other way around it. So tell me, think about the airlines that you've flown. There's probably fewer ones with trusting teams than ones without trusting teams. Number three was having a worthy rival. And this was an interesting one, because it's not talking about competition per se. It's talking about just having somebody you can measure up to improve, not to beat, to improve. It's like looking at somebody and saying, he's a better speaker because, and now taking on some of those things that you can be a better speaker, I guess. So, number four was the capacity for existential flexibility. This one I kind of still have a hard time with. I'm still learning about this one. But this is really being able to look at what you're doing and being willing to blow up what you're doing to protect the company. And and I guess I can't really explain this one. I haven't gotten to this one. I just haven't really delved into this one. It's really talking about the first couple so far. So, but this is the one to really make that shift, to change on a dime if you have to, I guess. And the final one is the courage to lead. And this is being willing to not know what you're doing, being willing to be that vulnerable and leading your company. So I guess the big takeaway for me this week is, you know, and I feel this in corporations that I work with or have been working with as a client, is you can really tell the ones that are really in business, not so much for the business, but they see it as a bigger picture. Yes, making money is important because if you don't make money, you can't pay your people. But, an interesting, I was just thinking about this. Walmart. When Sam Walton started Walmart, his premise was to give people good prices. And while Sam Walton was around, that's what he did. Treated his employees fairly, gave his clients good, fair priced products, actually, probably very good priced products. And places wanted Walmarts. They wanted them in their community because they were good employers and they took care of their customers. And you know what happened? Sam Walton became one of the wealthiest people. And he wasn't focused on making the money. He was focused on the first two. He just happened to get the third. That shifted with the first CEO that took over after Sam Walton. And at that point, um, people started to, the employees started to get poorly paid. There was thoughts of unionization. There were lots of lawsuits about how they treated people. And if you go back to what Simon said about playing a finite game in an infinite game, what happened? They started losing trust. They started losing cooperation. They stopped being innovative. And this is getting me to reflect on, what companies do I want to work for? Is my business operating as an infinite game or a finite game? And I'm still trying to evaluate that. And I think there's lots of good things that our company does, and there's some not so good things. So hopefully we can turn them around and continue it on. But really start to look at how is your company playing the game? And if you like it, great. Stay with it. Keep doing what you're doing. But if you're uncertain, think about it. Is it the company you want to be working for? Is it not? Anyway, thanks for joining me tonight. I hope you've enjoyed Live Life with Sean. Look, if you'd like to talk to me some more about it, go to my website, SeanCHiggins.com. Go to Connect with Sean page and leave me a message. We'll set up a time, we'll chat. If you enjoyed this show, please share it, subscribe to it, like it, leave a comment or question. This is going to help others find this podcast. I hope you enjoyed tonight. And until next week, have a wonderful week.